Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. This is an educational channel. I try to check out and inform you of great theories of everything, all-encompassing theories, grand unified theories, magnum opuses, tour de forces, and earth-shattering discoveries, mostly from obscure sources. And today is Bible Decode number 262. We've been looking at the little-known Roman origins hypothesis for the New Testament that, in my opinion, has great explanatory power, devastating implications, and a whole lot of evidence, both circumstantial and direct. The idea is that the New Testament of the Bible was not written by Aramaic fishermen and Aramaic-speaking fishermen, but by the Caesars of the Flavian dynasty of Roman Caesars. That's Emperor Vespasian and his two sons, Titus and Domitian, from 69 until 96 AD. And I'm also including, the court historian or some other intellectual that mingles with that court, the court of the Roman Caesars, the Flavians, but under their auspices. Now, they wrote the story of the Gospels in particular, for the purposes of psychological warfare against the Jews. The Romans had just gotten done defeating and really decimating the Jews in a war from 66 until 73 AD. And Vespasian and Titus were both military commanders in that war, and were both wounded in that war, and had both observed long period of time that the Jews were engaged in nearly constant revolt against the Romans, going back over 125 years. And I guess the Flavians were sick of it at a certain point. The Flavians were tired of putting so much time and effort into managing the Jews, more so than any other ethnic group or tribe or any group that Rome was in control of. And so they backdated the story by about 40 years, and then they wrote a story. They knew that the Jews were waiting for a Messiah, a military commander that was going to come in and help to throw out the Romans from Jerusalem, from Judea. And so instead, the Romans wrote a story of a Jewish Messiah who was a Prince of Peace, and who believed in rendering unto Caesar and walking the extra mile and turning the other cheek. While at the same time, when dealing with the Jews, he was overturning the tables of the money changers, and he was castigating the merchants of who were selling small animals for sacrifice. So if you look at all of the Gospels as a whole, Jesus does nothing against the Romans, but he does a whole lot of things against the Jews, mostly attacking the Jewish customs, the Jewish family, and the rituals, kosher food, circumcision, observance of the Sabbath. These are all things that Jesus is not so strict about compared to your average certainly Nazarene, but your average kind of pious Jew. And then as we move on in the New Testament, we find that Paul is even more so, even more pro-Roman and more anti-Jew. Now, I've gone over ad nauseum in the previous videos all of the evidence for Roman origins hypothesis. The main thing, in order to really crack the code, you need to have another book, which is also written by the Flavians. It's called War of the Jews. It's a history of this war between 66 and 73 AD. And it's written by a fellow named Josephus, and he's actually known as Flavius Josephus because he's a member of the Flavian clan and by adoption. Originally was a Jew, defected to the Romans. Got a lot of favors from them, which are quite improbable that they would have occurred, which leads me to suggest that possibly Josephus never existed and was just a pen name. But regardless, his War of the Jews comes out in 7 volumes, and when read alongside the Gospels, and in particular the book of Luke, the parallels literally jump off the page. Michael Menescot's found over 250 parallels just in the book of Luke, and many of the parallels are involved, detailed, well hidden, well constructed, and almost genius in their design. Many of them are less so, but a clear intentionality can be seen by looking through them, and the intention is mean-spirited, mocking, ridiculing, demeaning, and otherwise trying to humiliate the Jews. And really anybody who reads this gospel and takes it seriously. So that includes everybody who's, following the New Testament up to this day. Now, certainly it's a limited hangout. They put a lot of valuable and pious and righteous stuff in the New Testament, but it's all derivative, either of the Roman Stoicism or Greek Platonism or Egyptian philosophy, mystery religions. That's where all the miracles come from. If you look at any of those mystery religions that were coming out around that time, they all walked on water, and they all cured people with leprosy and such like. But so you can find, and that's really what Christians generally do, is they cherry pick verses. So they found all the stuff in the New Testament that is good, and they emphasize that. And they kind of just shove the other stuff under the rug. Some of it looks good, but then when you actually kind of know the inside joke, then it doesn't look so good. But either way, there's clear intentionality that it's the Romans. We want you to know that we did it, and hopefully all these clues that we're leaving, you'll figure it out someday. Now, the mightiest clue that they left is that they actually made the parallels based on a pattern. Michael Menescot's in his book Christianity's Origin, he graphs all those 250 plus parallels that he found on a chart using the book of Luke on the vertical axis and War of the Jews on the horizontal. And they make 5 almost perfect letters in Latin, the language of the Roman Caesars. APTVS. So we'll just conclude that T and V are Titus and Vespasian, and the others probably were whoever else was involved, possibly Arius Piso. possibly a younger brother of Titus, Domitian, who's sometimes known as the Holy Spirit, or Agia Pneuma for the AP. Either way, the main point is that the Romans signed their name to the New Testament. So hopefully the code would someday be broken. Also, Joseph Atwill in his book Caesar's Messiah found that Jesus' ministry is nothing but a replica of Titus's military campaign in Judea. Every place that Titus goes, Jesus also goes, in the same order, and they encounter parallel events at each location, spaced out by exactly 40 years in time. And there's over 40 such events, which puts it in the astronomically unlikely to be coincidental category. Now, what we're looking at today is a chapter from a book from Robert Eisenman that's called The Dead Sea Scrolls and the First Christians. And he's going into, in this chapter, it's called Paul as Herodian. So he's going into kind of a thick description with a lot of detective work, you know, one clue here, one clue there, from a person that has just got incredibly broad scholarship knowledge of, like, not one of the heroes of the Dead Sea Scrolls and getting them published eventually, translated and published, but also many of the other more obscure first century documents from Syria and all these pseudo-Clementine documents, as well as even later, you know, the Quran. And so he uses a lot of these different documents to kind of piece together who these people are that Paul's hanging out with, and that appear especially in the book of Acts and a lot of the epistles, but to a lesser extent in the New Testament. A lot of these people that are just, they're mentioned, but they're not really elaborated on in the New Testament. They're either Herods, the puppet dynasty of the Romans. You know, there were a couple dozen Herods, and they all had jobs of, there was Herod the king, he was the first one. And then there were a bunch of other Herods who were governors or provincial leaders or procurators and what have you. And so his argument here is that Paul, to explain Paul's blatant pro-Romanism and anti-Jewism, he postulates that Paul was a member of the Herod family. So this is called Paul as Herodian. We're about halfway through, I think. It also very easily explains the matter of Paul's Roman citizenship, which is such an important element in these escapes. Now, we just got done reading a book called Operation Messiah, where Paul is speculated to have been a secret agent of the Romans, or a spy of the Romans, who faked his conversion on the road to Damascus in order to infiltrate the Nazarenes and, you know, make sure that they stay in line, working for the Romans. You know, in both cases, the Roman origins hypothesis just has way more explanatory power. Just say that Paul is entirely fiction and the Gospels themselves are entirely fiction, instead of trying to shoehorn him into the Herod family or shoehorn him into being a Roman spy. And they're just more narrow solutions to that they have to kind of piece together the evidence, where if you recognize that the Romans did the whole thing, then the evidence just kind of falls into place. Okay, it will be recalled that Josephus records that Herod and his father, the first Roman procurator in Palestine, after the original storming of the temple by Pompey's forces in 63 BC. So that's when the Romans kind of conquered Judea. It was a 63 BC. And that was Antipater. I believe Herod's father's name was Antipater. And so he was Herod and his father were granted citizenship in perpetuity, along with all their heirs, for conspicuous service rendered in the cause of Rome. As it turns out, this Roman confidence was not ill-placed. In turn, it helps explain why Paul is always so convinced of his own Jewishness, while others seem to have misgivings concerning it. And it throws considerable light on the peculiar manner in which he chooses to exercise this Judaism. Paul's claim to being of the tribe of Benjamin may relate to a general genre of such claims in the diaspora, as it does in the War Scroll at Qumran, one of the sectarian documents of the Dead Sea Scrolls. But it also illustrates the superficial case with which such claims could be passed off on credulous and relatively unschooled audiences. It is more likely that Paul derives the claim to Benjaminite birth, which he does at Philemon 3:5 and Acts 13:21, not from any actual genealogical link, but from the simple fact that his Hebrew namesake, Saul, was of the tribe of Benjamin. That doesn't seem to explain anything. I think I'm missing something. There is also a third, somewhat more esoteric possibility. This has to do with the biblical description of the Benjaminites as sons of Belial in Jude 19:22. What is that? Maybe that's Jubilees? I don't know. In addition, it relates to an anomaly in biblical genealogies that the name Bela in Genesis, from the same Hebrew root as Belial and Balaam, is both the first Benjaminite tribe and the name of the first Edomite king. That is, there are terminological overlaps in the Bible between the genealogy of the Edomites and the Benjaminites, as a result of which Herodians really might have considered themselves and made the claim of being of the tribe of Benjamin. If Herodians, as Greco-Arab Edomites, in addition to considering themselves children of Abraham, another favorite area of allegorical speculation in Paul, they were also making Benjaminite claims. This would be a component of Paul's use of the term, not to mention Qumran's inversion of it in its Belial accusations. Now, Eisenman is pretty difficult to read out loud because he uses a ton of dashes, like with asides, and a ton of parentheticals. And so, you know, if you read the parenthetical out loud, you kind of lose the... he uses a lot of long parentheticals and long dashes, too. And so then you can't get back to the flow of the original sentence. Paul's reputed description of himself as a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee, in Acts 23:6, is also readily explained by his Herodian pedigree. And I have been at some pains to set forth the Pharisaic connections of the Herodians in his earlier book called Maccabees, Zadokites, Christians, and Qumran. And in another paper given to the Society of Biblical Literature in 1983, Confusions of Pharisees and Essenes in Josephus. That's interesting. Now, my take on it is that Josephus never existed. He wrote as a pen name of some Roman with some Jewish blood, and a knowledge of the Jewish traditions, but also that the Essenes never existed either. They have only been mentioned in Josephus and in, I believe, Pliny the Elder and some other Roman, Philo Judaeus, who isn't exactly a Roman, but his nephew Tiberius Alexander, they were very wealthy Hellenized Jews from Alexandria, and so they were controlled by the Romans more or less, friends of the Caesars, and those are the only times that the Essenes are actually mentioned. And so I think it is folly to kind of think that Jesus was an Essene. It's obviously complete folly, given that all of this is fiction. So Jesus was fiction, the Essenes were fiction, and Josephus was a fiction. So you don't have much to work with. That's why I think people have shied away from the Roman origins hypothesis, is that it's just too devastating. You know, what are we going to do if, you know, the two main sources of first century history and, you know, geography, culture, war, all of politics, those are both fiction, and they're both part of a psychological operation by the Romans. So we have nothing left. But now we've discovered these Dead Sea Scrolls in the last 80 years, and they seem to depict that time period, although there's some debate about when the Dead Sea Scrolls were written. Mostly, I believe, in the 1st century AD, though. And I think that had a lot to do with the delay of getting them published, because translated and published, because that was under the auspices of this Dominican Catholic priest cadre that had kind of taken custody of the Dead Sea Scrolls and just sat on them for like 40 years and just published them in a like a dribble, you know, one small document per year or something like that. And I think it was because they didn't like what they said, but in particular, they recognized that they were written like at the same time that Jesus was supposed to have been alive. We earlier in this Reciprocal Church section, we did go over the book that's called The Dead Sea Scrolls Deception, and they cover that at length in there. So go back in the archives to find that. These connections are perhaps best illustrated by the anti-Maccabee, and these are the connections with the Essenes and the Pharisees. These connections are perhaps best illustrated by the anti-Maccabean tendencies of the Pharisee party in general, and the cry conserved I'm not familiar with this abbreviation, but MSOT 7-8 of those assembled, presumably Pharisees. Maybe it's from the Talmud. When Agrippa, whether one or two is not specified, probably one. When coming to read the Deuteronomic king law, thou shalt not put a foreigner over you who is not your brother. It's Deuteronomy 17:5, and it's also in the Temple Scroll of the Dead Sea Scrolls. thou shalt not put a foreigner over you who is not your brother. Already mentioned as begins to weep. Um, there's like 3 sets of dashes in this sentence, and it's just a disaster to convey it. So, you are our brother. You are our brother. You are our brother. For the purposes of Zadokite history in Palestine, and the Zadokites were like a priestly class, going all the way back to, I believe, David and Solomon. History in Palestine, the mirror reversals of this episode are the attempt by Simon, the head of an assembly or ecclesia or church of his own in Jerusalem, to bar Agrippa I from the temple as a foreigner in the 40s, and the wall built by temple zealots in the next generation to bar Agrippa II's view of the sacrifices, not to mention this Agrippa's ultimate expulsion with his sister Bernice by these same zealots from all of Jerusalem not long afterwards. Now this event is the 66 AD uprising of the Jews, and Herod Agrippa II was in control of Jerusalem, and they expelled him. They kicked him out of Jerusalem, and that began the revolt and caused Emperor Nero to send for General Vespasian. And so Agrippa fled back to Rome, and apparently his sister slash sexual partner Bernice went with him. These were probably 2 of the chief architects of the New Testament. Agrippa II, Bernice, also Tiberius Alexander, Emperor Titus, and whoever was Josephus, which may have been Arius Piso, which is according to the research done by Abelard Reuchlin and Roman Piso. They both independently believed that the New Testament was written by Josephus, who was really Arius Piso, who doesn't even show up in the historical record, but he shows up a lot in letters that are written amongst these Roman royals. Okay, it is this wall built around 61 or 62 AD that would appear in this context to be the immediate cause of James's stoning. The temple scroll, as we saw, makes the Qumran interest in these matters palpable, not only delineating the building of such barriers, but even evoking the Deuteronomic king law and going into the marital practices of the king, insisting that in addition to not multiplying or taking foreign wives, he keep the same wife his whole life. All matters relevant to the general fornication charge leveled by Qumran and perhaps by James against Herodians. Paul's Herodian links might even explain how, as a comparatively young man, he could have wielded such powers when he first came to Jerusalem and been authorized by the high priest to search out Christians in areas as far afield as Damascus. Whether we are dealing with the Damascus settlement of Qumran illusion or the actual settlement of Jews in Damascus, it is impossible to tell from the sources. They readily explain his easy entrance into Jerusalem ruling circles, all matters that have never adequately been explained. The reference noted above, immediately preceding the one to Herodian in Romans 16:10, to a certain household of Aristobulus, consolidates these suspicions even further. Though Aristobulus may have been a common name, still it is most prominent among Herodians. There were in fact 2 or 3 Aristobuluses from different Herodian genealogical lines living at the same time. the most interesting of whom was the son of Agrippa the first brother Herod of Chelsea, already remarked above. In addition, it was this Aristobulus who had a son called Herod, that is Herodian, the littlest Herod. So far, our evidence is all inferential, but there is a surprising notice from another quarter which straightforwardly makes the charge we have been implying. Epiphanius, who conserves many traditions found in rabbinic literature, including, for instance, the one about Jesus being the son of a Roman legionnaire called Panthera, found in the Talmud, conserves a tradition about Paul's background. According to it, Paul was a non-Jew who came up to Jerusalem and converted to Judaism because he wanted to marry the high priest's daughter. Disappointed in this design, Paul defected from Judaism and turned against circumcision and the law. So that's a quote from somewhere in the Talmud. Epiphanius attributes this notice, and so in this tradition, I believe also Jesus then is the illegitimate son of a Roman soldier, also in there. So, I think your average Christian would laugh out the Talmud. Ralph Ellis says that the Talmud was also written by Josephus, the early writings of the rabbinic tradition in the late 1st century. And certainly the rabbinic tradition was under the auspices of the Roman Flavians. They put aside the land for the Pharisaic Jews to occupy a kind of a campus or a college for the study of the Jewish scriptures at Jaffna, just after the war there, at the exact same time that Christianity was founded. So the Romans were using psychological warfare in the form of fake religions in both cases, against the Pharisaic Jews and against the Zealot Jews. Epiphanius attributes this notice to the Anabathmi Moi Jacobu, or the Ascents of James, a lost work about the debates of James with the high priests and the Pharisees on the temple stairs, from which presumably it takes its name, also finding refraction